Let me ask you something. What is the worst thing a powerful organization can do to the best athlete in their sport? Not ban them outright. Not strip a title in a public hearing where at least the person gets a chance to defend themselves. Not make a decision so obviously wrong that everyone in the room knows it, and the press covers it, and the injustice has a shape you can point to and argue against. The worst thing is slower than that. Quieter. More deliberate. It arrives dressed as paperwork. It looks like a technical committee making reasonable adjustments to complex regulations. It uses language like competitive balance and parity and leveling the playing field. Neutral, administrative language that makes it nearly impossible to argue against without sounding like a sore loser. But underneath all of that language, underneath all of that procedural camouflage, it is something specific and something calculated. It is erasure, not the dramatic kind, not the kind that leaves fingerprints. The kind that works slowly, over multiple seasons, through a series of rule changes that each look defensible in isolation and that collectively add up to the systematic destruction of one team's ability to compete, a team that had done nothing wrong except be too good for too long in a sport whose financial backers found that level of goodness commercially inconvenient. That is what happened to Ronnie Sox, the most dominant driver Pro Stock had ever produced. A man who won 6 out of 8 national events in a single season, and then, after the NHRA rewrote the rulebook in direct response to those wins, never won another NHRA national event for the rest of his career. Not because he got slower, not because his team stopped working, not because anyone ever found a specific violation or cited a specific rule that had been broken, but because the organization that was supposed to protect the integrity of the sport he had mastered decided, in private, that his mastery was a business problem to be managed rather than an athletic achievement to be honored. This is that story, and it is one of the most important stories in the history of American drag racing, which is precisely why it has never been told honestly by the people most responsible for what happened. Stay with me, because by the time we're done, you are going to understand something about how power really why works in organized sport that most fans spend their entire lives watching without ever fully grasping. To understand what was done to Ronnie Sox, you first need to understand the world he operated in. Because the story doesn't make full sense without the context, without understanding what American drag racing actually was in the late 1960s and early 1970s, what the stakes were, and why one team's dominance was capable of threatening something much larger than a single competition. American drag racing in this era was not a hobby. It was not a weekend pursuit for enthusiasts with too much time and disposable income. It was a corporate battlefield. Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors had decided that the drag strip was the arena in which they would fight proxy wars for the hearts, minds, and purchasing decisions of the American car-buying public. The logic was brutally simple, and the manufacturers understood it with perfect clarity. Win on Sunday, sell on Monday. What happened at the drag strip on the weekend rippled out through showrooms on weekdays. A manufacturer whose cars dominated the quarter mile had its performance image validated in the most visceral and publicly visible W. Possible. In an era when the American muscle car was the cultural touchstone it was when young men made identity-level decisions about which brand to align with based partly on what they saw racing, that validation was worth an enormous amount of money. So the factories poured resources in, real resources. Factory-backed programs with full engineering support, dedicated racing departments, purpose-built components that had no street application whatsoever, and budgets that would have seemed staggering to a civilian observer. This was not people racing cars. This was corporations conducting warfare through cars. And into this specific, expensive, extremely high-stakes arena came a partnership out of Burlington, North Carolina, that would eventually come to define what pro stock excellence actually looked like. Sox and Martin, Ronnie Sox and Buddy Martin, a partnership that started almost accidentally. Buddy Martin's repeated inability to beat Ronnie Sox on the match race circuit had led to a simple business conclusion, the kind that only seems obvious in retrospect. If you cannot beat this person, put yourself on the same side as this person. It was a decision that turned out to be one of the most consequential in drag racing history. Not because Buddy Martin was wrong about his inability to beat Sox, but because what he had recognized in that inability was something worth recognizing. He was in the presence of a genuine gift, and gifts of that particular magnitude are rare enough that when you encounter one, the correct response is to build around it rather than compete against it. Ronnie Sox could operate a 4-speed manual transmission at a level that other drivers watched and could not fully explain. I want to be specific about this because it matters. The 4-speed transmission was the great equalizer and differentiator of Pro Stock's formative years. Every car had one. Every driver had to operate one, and the differences between drivers in their ability to manage a high-powered car through 4 gear changes across a quarter mile were enormous, far larger than casual observers appreciated. The best drivers found tenths of seconds that the merely good couldn't access. The elite found hundredths that the best couldn't touch. Sox found hundredths that made the elite feel like they were in a different competition. There are accounts from competitor who watched him work from the starting line and came away genuinely uncertain about what they had witnessed. The shifts were that clean. The timing was that precise. The car behaved under his hands with a smoothness and consistency that implied something beyond practice technique, a mechanical sympathy. A feel for what the machine was doing and what it needed at any given millisecond that most drivers never develop regardless of how many years they spend trying. He understood the machine not as something to be fought and managed, but as something to be partnered with. And that understanding, expressed through thousands of incremental decisions made in fractions of seconds that the human conscious mind cannot fully process, produced results that were both consistent and dominant in a way that made his competitors uncomfortable in a specific and deep way. It was not the discomfort of facing someone who had more resources or a better funded program or a luckier day. It was the discomfort of facing someone who was genuinely, measurably, and apparently permanently better at the specific thing the competition was testing. That is a different kind of uncomfortable. It raises questions about what the point of continuing to try actually is. Buddy Martin understood the value of what he was partnering with. He built an operation around it. Jake King handled engine preparation with a level of precision and expertise that matched Sox's driving ability. The chassis work, the testing discipline, the systematic approach to understanding what the car was doing and why all of it functioned at a level that reflected what happened when serious, experienced people decided to build around a talent rather than work around it. And at the center of all of it was the engine that completed the picture. The 426 Chrysler Hemi is not just an engine, it is a document. A declaration in metal and engineering of what Chrysler's best people could do when given the resources and the mandate to do it as well as it could be done. The hemispherical combustion chamber designed the feature that gives the engine its name aloud. For larger valves positioned at more advantageous angles than conventional wedge engine designs. More valve area meant better breathing. Better breathing meant more complete combustion. More complete combustion meant more power extracted from each cycle. It was elegant, and in the truest engineering sense, it solved multiple problems simultaneously with a single coherent design philosophy, and it scaled effectively as you pushed the engine harder. In drag racing applications, these characteristics translated into performance that was genuinely superior to the alternatives in the specific circumstances of pro stock competition. Not dramatically superior, this was not a situation where the gap was so large that no other approach could ever be competitive, but consistently, reliably, dependably superior in the way that professional racing programs need their equipment to be when every fraction of a second matters and consistency of performance is as important as peak performance. In Ronnie Sox's hands, paired with Jake King's preparation and Buddy Martin's organizational discipline, the Hemi became something that the rest of the pro stock field had a serious and recurring problem with. Not occasionally, not in specific favorable conditions. Week after week, event after event, at venues across the country, under varying track conditions and weather, the combination of Ronnie Sox and the 426 Hemi produced results that were starting to feel less like competitive dominance and more like inevitability. And by 1971, the inevitability had become statistical. The numbers deserved to be stated plainly, because they are the foundation of everything that followed. In 1971, NHRA Pro Stock held 8 national events. Ronnie Sox and the Sox and Martin Hemi-powered Plymouth won 6 of them. 75%. 3/4 of every race contested at the national level in the sport's most prominent class that year were won by the same driver in the same car from the same team. In a professional motorsport series theoretically structured around genuine open competition, a 75% win rate is not the result of a team operating well in a competitive field. It is the result of a team operating in a fundamentally different category from the competition. A team that has reached a level through whatever combination of talent, preparation, engineering, and institutional knowledge that the rest of the field cannot access. The races told the story with a directness that aggregate statistics can sometimes soften. Other teams arrived at each event having prepared as hard as they knew how to prepare, running the best equipment they had. Add access to fielding experienced and capable drivers who had years of competitive experience at the highest level of the sport. They qualified. They advanced through elimination brackets. They did everything that a professional racing team at a professional racing event is supposed to do, and they lost. Round after round, event after event, the progression through the brackets arrived at the same place. Ronnie Sox at the top and everyone else working out how far down they finished. The crowds enjoyed it, at least in the immediate sense. Sox was spectacular. His launches were violent in the way that great drag racing launches are violent. The kind of violence that makes a crowd collectively hold its breath and then exhale in a single sound when the car simply drives forward with a planted, controlled authority that makes other cars look like they're struggling. The shifts were crisp enough to see the car settle and surge through each gear change, a rhythmic pattern that was distinctly his, that you could identify from the stands before you saw the number on the car. But in the offices where the money decisions were made, the manufacturer racing departments, the budget committees, the senior executives looking at their program's win-loss records and asking whether the return justified the investment, the spectacle looked considerably less enjoyable. A Chrysler Hemi was winning 75% of the races. Chevrolet was not winning 75% of the races. Ford was not winning 75% of the races. The manufacturers whose budgets were keeping the entire professional apparatus of the NHRA running were watching their programs lose 3 out of every 4 events to a Chrysler product driven by one specific human being. And in the offices of the NHRA, where those manufacturers' voices carried the specific weight that comes from being the people whose checks fund your organization's existence, the phone lines were active in the winter of 1971. What happened next was written into the 1972 rulebook. Here is what the NHRA did, and I want to walk through it with the precision it deserves, because the precision is exactly what makes it so damning. Through Pro Stock's first 2 seasons, 1970 and 1971, every car in the class ran under the same weight-to-displacement formula, 7 pounds per cubic inch. Uniform, applied without distinction. T-on to every engine combination in the class regardless of manufacturer, design philosophy, or competitive record. The formula's logic was straightforward. A larger engine carries more weight, which offsets some of the displacement advantage. It was not perfect, but it was at least consistent and transparent. No engine type received special treatment. No manufacturer's program was singled out. The same arithmetic applied to everyone. In 1972, the NHRA ended that uniformity. 3 separate weight formulas replaced the single one. Cars running staggered valve wedge engines, the kind Chevrolet and most of the non-Hemi competition was using, remained at 7 pounds per cubic inch, unchanged from the 2 seasons prior. Cars running hemispherical combustion chamber engines, meaning specifically the Chrysler 426 Hemi, the engine that had just won 6 of 8 national events in the hands of Ronnie Sox, moved to 7.25 pounds per cubic inch, a 1/4 pound per cubic inch difference. Let me translate that into something concrete. 426 cubic inches multiplied by a 1/4 pound per inch equals 106.5 pounds. 106 pounds of mandatory additional ballast added specifically and exclusively to the engine combination that one team had been using to win 3/4 of all available national events the previous season. In a class where competitive margins were measured in hundredths of seconds, where the difference between a winning elapsed time and a losing one was often expressed in numbers requiring 4 decimal places. where teams spent enormous effort eliminating every unnecessary ounce from their cars, because every ounce cost time and time was the only currency that mattered. 106 additional pounds, targeted at one engine, used by one team, that had just dominated the season so thoroughly that the manufacturers whose programs were losing had apparently made their unhappiness known in terms the NHRA found impossible to ignore. This is not competitive balance. This is not a neutral sanctioning body making a difficult but defensible technical decision about how to manage a complex multivariable competitive environment. This is an organization using its regulatory authority as a financial instrument, adjusting the rulebook not to produce better racing, but to produce more comfortable outcomes for the programs whose money the organization depended upon. It is a suppression order, written in the language of technical regulation. What happened next in 1972 did not require interpretation. It required only arithmetic. Bill Jenkins had moved to a Chevrolet Vega, a compact subcompact car running a small block wedge engine. The rules as adjusted allowed him to run this combination at a weight that reflected both the car's compact dimensions and the favorable weight formula applied to his engine design. The result, when you ran the actual numbers, was extraordinary in its clarity. Jenkins' small block Chevrolet and Ronnie Sox's 426 Hemi were producing essentially equivalent horsepower per cubic inch. The engineering on both programs had advanced to a point where the two different approaches to the performance problem were extracting similar efficiency from their respective power plants, working within what the rules permitted. Same power output per cubic inch, equivalent engineering excellence. Two programs that had arrived at competitive parity through different technical paths. Jenkins' car could be made legal at 2,200 pounds. Sox's Hemi Mopar, because of the weight formula applied specifically and exclusively to his engine type, could not be made competitive at anything below approximately 3,100 pounds. 900 pounds. 900 additional pounds that Ronnie Sox was required to carry while producing equivalent power to the competitor who was not required to carry them. The math does not have opinions. It does not advocate for either side. It simply describes, with perfect neutrality, what the regulatory structure the NHRA had created actually produced. And what it produced was a situation in which the best driver in the class, running an engine that made equivalent power per cubic inch to his chief competitor, was required to do it while carrying 900 extra pounds. You cannot win like that, not even if you are Ronnie Sox. Not even if your preparation is perfect. Not even if every other variable in your program is optimized to the limit of what current knowledge and available technology can achieve. Physics does not make exceptions for talent. 900 pounds is 900 pounds regardless of whose hands are on the wheel. Chrysler was not quiet about this. They were not confused about what the weight break meant, or what had motivated it. They were not willing to accept the neutral framing of competitive balance adjustments at face value and move on. They lobbied. They made their objections known through every channel that a major manufacturer with a significant ongoing financial relationship with a sanctioning body has access to, which is to say, through channels that are significantly more direct and significantly more consequential than the channels available to individual teams or drivers. When those objections failed to produce the outcome they were seeking, Chrysler escalated. At the NHRA World Finals in Amarillo, the championship-determining event of the season, a race of maximum importance and maximum visibility, Chrysler withheld their factory-backed cars. Every factory-supported Mopar entry stayed in the trailer. No cars, no participation. A deliberate, costly, and unmistakably clear statement. We believe this decision is targeted, we believe it is unjust, and we are willing to absorb the financial and competitive cost of non-participation rather than legitimize by our presence a set of rules we believe to be fundamentally unfair. Think about what that decision requires. The cars are ready. The drivers are under contract. The logistics are in place. The entry fees have been paid. All of the preparation that goes into a national-level racing program has been done. You pull out of the event not because of a mechanical problem or a personnel issue or any of the normal reasons teams miss races, but because you believe that showing up and racing would represent an endorsement of a regulatory framework specifically designed to disadvantage you. That is not a small decision. That is a major corporation accepting real financial and reputational costs in service of a principle. And the principle, stated plainly, was this: the NHRA changed the rules because we were winning, and we will not pretend that it is acceptable. The protest was heard, it was acknowledged. And then, with the particular institutional confidence of an organization that knows where its money comes from, it was ignored. Chrysler went back to racing, the weight break stayed, and the 1972 season delivered a verdict that required no interpretation. 7 of 8 national events went to Chevrolet-powered cars in 1972. Jenkins in his Vega won 6, matching the total that Sox had achieved in the previous year with a small block wedge engine in a compact car, benefiting from precisely the regulatory structure that had been introduced to address Sox's equivalent dominance. The symmetry is almost too clean to be accidental. 6 wins for the Hemi in 1971. Rules changed. 6 wins for the small block in 1972. The NHRA had not produced better racing. They had transferred the dominance from one engine type to another. The competition was not more open. It was identically closed, just closed around a different winner. The only Mopar win in 1972 came from Don Carlton at the Gator Nationals. 1 win, in a season where the Hemi had won 6 the year before. And Ronnie Sox? 0 wins. The same driver, the same team, the same preparation, the same gift behind the wheel. 0 wins. Ask yourself the question honestly, because it deserves an honest answer. Did Ronnie Sox become a worse driver between the last race of 1971 and the first race of 1972? Did his hands change? Did his instincts deteriorate? Did the mechanical sympathy that had produced 6 national event victories in 8 attempts suddenly abandon him over the winter? Did Buddy Martin suddenly lose the organizational ability to do the job? Had built one of the most professional programs in the sport? Did Jake King's engine preparation fall apart? Did the team's decades of accumulated knowledge about how to prepare and race a pro stock car simply evaporate? None of that happened. The driver was the same driver. The team was the same team. The preparation was the same preparation. What had changed was the rulebook, and the rulebook had been changed in a way that made it mathematically close to impossible for the engine combination to win against competition that was not carrying 900 additional pounds. That is not a competitive outcome produced by fair sport. That is a predetermined result produced by regulatory design. The NHRA did not discover who was best in 1972. They decided who would win and then wrote the rules to produce that decision. What followed 1972 was not a clean break or a dramatic confrontation. It was something more grinding and more difficult, in many ways a slow, attritional erosion of a program that had been at the top of the sport and now found itself fighting for relevance against a regulatory environment that had been specifically restructured to ensure its decline. Sox and Martin kept fighting. They were professionals, which meant they did not simply accept the situation as permanent and stop trying. They explored smaller displacement Hemi configurations to reduce the weight penalty exposure. They looked for every legitimate technical angle available to them within the adjusted rules. They continued to show up, continued to prepare at a high level, continued to race with the professionalism and the competitive intensity that had built their reputation. But the wins did not come. Could not come, given what the rules required them to carry. The weight break situation continued to evolve through the mid-1970s, and it never evolved in a direction that restored anything like the competitive equity that had existed in 1970 and 1971. The gap between what the rules allowed the Hemi combination to do and what the small block compact combinations could do was never closed to a point where talent and preparation alone could bridge it. And as the years passed without national event wins, as the dominant program that had won 6 of 8 in 1971 accumulated season after season without adding to that total the financial realities that always eventually assert themselves. Vests in professional motorsport began to make themselves felt. Factory support, which had been a significant element of the team's sustainability, dried up as the factories made their own calculations about where their racing investments were most likely to produce the visibility and the victories they were spending for. Without wins, the argument for continued investment became harder to make. Without investment, the resources required to maintain a program at the level that wins demand became harder to sustain. The cycle that professional racing teams enter when competitive success and financial support feed each other began to run in reverse. By 1975, the partnership came to an end, not with a dramatic announcement or a public statement of grievance. Simply and quietly, the way things end when the energy required to continue has finally exceeded what is available, and when the honest accounting of what the future holds does not support continued investment in the effort. Sox and Martin, the team that had defined an era, gone. Look at the NHRA Pro Stock record books. The wins are there. 6 national event victories in 1971. The documentation of what Sox and Martin accomplished is present in the historical record in the way that it should be. But there is a question the record books cannot answer. A question that I think is the most important question in this entire story, and that the NHRA has never addressed with anything approaching honesty. What would those record books look like if the rules had not been changed specifically because the numbers were getting too high? What does 1972 look like for Ronnie Sox on a genuinely level playing field where his engine is subject to the same formula as every other engine, where he is not required to carry 106 additional pounds because the manufacturers whose cars he kept beating made phone calls to the people who write the rules? What does 1973 look like? What does the career total look like for a driver of his demonstrable ability, the ability that produced 6 wins out of 8 attempts in the most competitive season Pro Stock had seen, competing in an environment where excellence was rewarded with recognition rather than regulated away with ballast? We will never know. That is the nature of what was done to him. The erasure was not retroactive. Nobody went back into the record books and changed the wins that happened. It was perspective, a closing of the future, a set of decisions that ensured the record books would never show what they might have shown, what they should have shown. If the governing body of the sport had done its job with the neutrality it claimed to embody, the wins that did not happen because the rules prevented them cannot be added. The championships that were not won because the rules were structured to produce different outcomes cannot be retroactively awarded. The career that was cut short at its peak by decisions made in rooms Ronnie Sox was not invited into cannot be extended. What the records show is what happened. What they do not and cannot show is what was taken. And what was taken, the future that should have been there, the record that should have accumulated, the statistical legacy that should have reflected one of the greatest pure driving talents the quarter mile has ever seen, was taken deliberately by people who understood exactly what they were doing and made a calculated decision that the financial cost of allowing excellence to continue was higher than the moral cost of preventing it. That decision has never been acknowledged. The people who made it have never been required to explain it publicly. The organization that implemented it has spent 5 decades describing what happened in the language of technical adjustment and competitive balance, while the man most directly affected described it in the language of understatement and grace. There is a statement from Ronnie Sox himself, offered in a later retrospective, that deserves to be quoted and then examined with the care it warrants. He said, "It looked really unfair to me from the outside, but we still ended up winning most of the races anyway. No one else in Pro Stock really had to deal with the rule changes as much as I did. In looking back, we still came out of it pretty well." Read every phrase in that statement. It looked really unfair. Not it was unfair, it looked unfair. The passive construction, the visual framing, as if the injustice were something observed from a distance rather than experienced directly and personally and at enormous cost to his career. The understatement in that phrasing, for a man describing the systematic regulatory dismantling of his competitive program at its peak, is almost architectural in its deliberateness. He had built a wall of grace around something that warranted a much louder response, and he chose not to knock it down even when the invitation was there. No one else in Pro Stock really had to deal with the rule changes as much as I did. This is the acknowledgement, the thing that the understatement was surrounding. This is Ronnie Sox saying directly and without ambiguity that the rule changes were not applied uniformly across the field, that they landed on him specifically, that no other competitor in the class bore anything like the same weight of regulatory response to their competitive success, that what was done at him, to him, because of him. We still came out of it pretty well. For a career that was cut short at its absolute peak, For a program that won 6 of 8 national events and then never won another one because the rules were changed to prevent it. For a partnership that eventually dissolved under the accumulated weight of competing in an environment that had been structured against it. Pretty well. He called it pretty well. The generosity in that phrase, the decision to measure a career that was partially taken from him against some standard other than WH. At it could have been tells you something about the kind of person Ronnie Sox was. Something that the organizations and the manufacturers and the rule writers who engineered his program's decline perhaps did not deserve. He gave them grace they had not earned. The NHRA has never issued a formal statement acknowledging that the 1972 weight breaks were introduced because Ronnie Sox was winning too much. They have never acknowledged the relationship between the factory program's complaints and the regulatory changes that followed in the winter of 1971. They have never addressed directly whether those decisions were genuinely about competitive balance or about something more specific and less defensible. The official histories describe the changes as adjustments, as technical decisions made in the interest of the sport, as efforts to produce better racing across a class that was experiencing competitive imbalance. None of those descriptions are false, exactly. They are simply missing the most important part of the story, the part about why those specific adjustments were made at that specific moment, targeting that specific engine combination used most prominently by that specific team. The silence around that part of the story has lasted more than 50 years. It will probably last indefinitely, because the people who made the decisions are gone and the organization has no institutional incentive to revisit them honestly. But the math remains. The numbers from 1971 and 1972 remain. The 900-pound weight disparity between equivalent power outputs remains. Chrysler's protest at Amarillo remains. The fact that Ronnie Sox, the man who won 6 of 8 national events, the best driver in his class at the peak of his career, never won another national event after the rules were changed remains. Those things do not require interpretation. They require only the willingness to look at them directly and call them what they are. The best driver in pro stock was erased, not by accident, not through competitive defeat by a superior program, through deliberate regulatory action taken at the request of financial interests that found his excellence commercially inconvenient. Ronnie Sox called it looking really unfair. He was, as usual, being too generous. Subscribe, share it, because the next video goes somewhere darker than this one. We're going inside the spec. If the financial pressures that made this decision feel necessary to the people who made it, we're talking about the manufacturers, the money, the calculations that get made when institutional survival and athletic fairness point in opposite directions. Today was the what. Next time is the why behind the why. See you there.